Hi, I'm Edward Simmerer, and this is Get a Better Meta podcast. And we're talking today with Damien Garrett. And Damien is going to tell us a little bit about the goal of education. So, Damien, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your background is, and then we'll talk about what the goal of education is.
Yes, hello, Ed. Thank you for having me on this podcast. I am my name is Damien Garrett. I grew up at a little farm in Minnesota, was homeschooled most of my life, went to a boarding school in St. Mary's, Kansas for 3 years of my education. And then I went to the seminary for about 3 years of formation, and then left the seminary and went to Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in New Hampshire. Was there for another 2 years, accepted some of my seminary credits there. So I was able to graduate with a bachelor's in liberal arts after just 2 years there. Got to spend one semester in Rome with them. That was very, very formative. And then now I'm teaching here at Mater Dei Academy. I teach middle school science and math and 10th grade Latin.
Awesome. So, you and I both, you are a teacher, I was a teacher. So, I think both of us, we've got an idea of what the goal of education is. So, what do you think? Could you put it into a definition? Could you define, or could you point out the goal of education? What do you think it is?
Yeah. And as we've sort of mentioned, I'll be taking a lot of my thoughts from an author, Father Edward Leen. I first discovered him. Father Sherry wrote an article in, I believe it was the Angelus. When I was in the seminary, I read it, loved what he had to write. So I found the book. We actually had it in the seminary library, and I've fallen in love with the book ever since then. Read it several times. Every time I get more out of it, highly recommend. But I do love, he starts his book off with a definition that I just want to share with you here. I'll just read it directly. So his definition starts with "to the Christian." I just want to pause because I think that is so important to our understanding of a formation, because we are Catholic, and that's going to inform everything. He's going to talk about this all throughout the book, but I just wanted to pause there for a second. To the Christian, education is that culture of mind, the will, and the emotions, which, whilst adapting a man for the exercise of a particular calling, disposes him to achieve an excellent personal and social life within the framework of that calling. The object of education is nothing else than human happiness. I
Yeah.
just,
So
yeah,
I like that. I like that definition because I think if you had to, kind of nail it down, well, what's the point of anything that we do in life? It's to get to heaven, right? So what's the
right.
point of education? To raise souls up for heaven. But of course, in between there, we have to have kind of a approximate goal of education. And like Father Edward Leen says, it's to make human happiness. So here's my question for you then. If if our goal in education is to, you know, is specifically Christian, meaning that we're trying to get to heaven through education, and it's all about making people happy, what is it that we're actually teaching in school? So I'm trying to ask an even more proximate question. What are we teaching on a daily basis? Not just, ultimately, we're trying to get to heaven, right? That's because that's almost kind of obvious. But what is it specifically that we need to teach? What do you think
Yeah,
there?
yeah, it's almost so obvious, but it's also so elusive. How do you
Mhm.
teach Catholicism itself? There's no I mean, there's the catechism, but even the catechism,
Yeah.
you can't memorize Catholicism.
Uh,
That's why we have teachers, and I think that's really the beauty of it. Sorry, I'm diverging a little bit.
it's
Um,
good.
what what you are giving in 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 education, it must always grow what is human.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is
Yeah.
human? What makes us human?
Yeah, and I think Father Leen said it a little bit there in the
Right.
definition. I forget what he said, but didn't he say to educate the will and the emotions?
Yes.
Was that in the definition?
Right, exactly. The Christian, education is that culture of mind, the
Yeah.
will, and the emotions. You have the
So
intellect, the will, and the emotions.
yeah. So I think it's virtue.
Yeah.
I think it's virtue that we're trying to teach in school and education, that we're basically, if you had to say, you know, what is the goal of education? Well, we're trying to teach kids, people, how to be virtuous so they can be happy, so they can ultimately go to heaven, right?
Right. And one of the things that I really like about Lean is he does sort of temper down the sort of energetic new teacher who's gonna go and gonna save the world. We're
Yeah.
gonna, especially the liberal arts education, and I'm all for a liberal arts education,
Yeah.
but he adds in there the emotions. And while adapting a man for the exercise of a particular calling. So he definitely takes into mind, he has as the primary end happiness, that development of virtue in the highest sense, the theological virtues, that ordering of the will and the intellect towards the good. But he starts his book by saying that don't forget that want militates against happiness, which brings you back to Aristotle. When Aristotle is talking about virtue, he says that someone who is in need, who still is in want, cannot be happy. So he says that not everyone can be happy, is what Aristotle says, which as a Catholic, we is not true, because even the poor and even those who are suffering, even suffering can bring about happiness. But his point was that he's looking for some form of natural happiness, some, so to speak, purely human, as if we weren't called to God, happiness, and that want can militate against it. So I really like how Leen, he does add that, and we don't have to sit on that for a long time, but I do want to at the beginning as well mention that, as he does at the beginning of his book.
So does that mean that since Aristotle says basically, because of course Aristotle, he wasn't Catholic, he was pre-Catholic,
Right.
um, that he says, well, not everybody can be happy because not everybody can attain that natural state of happiness and own enough stuff to be happy, maybe. So that kind of brings up an interesting point. Would you say, and I think maybe Father Leen says, now of course I haven't actually read Father Leen's book, but it's on my mental list.
Sure.
Do you think he would say that education is specifically a Catholic thing?
Yes, for sure. I think this is where he would still differ from be different than Aristotle as a teacher, in that he does have the fullness of revelation. So he does know that we are made for God, which also, to give Aristotle his due, at the end of the Ethics, Aristotle does come to the conclusion that for man to be happy, he would need to be in a constant activity of contemplation of the highest things, and ultimately contemplation of God.
Which can only be
And
developed through virtue, right?
right. That's exactly what he says in the Ethics, which is impressive to him. But yes, how Father Leen ties even the natural into it is, he will say, as we know as Catholics, God is everywhere. So he will tie, even in the material things that he is encouraging, this learning of a particular vocation, as he calls it. For example, if you're going to be a plumber, be a good plumber and understand how these things work, because they're made for God. So that's a sort of a bit of a pitch for the material side. So he's not a materialist and a Catholic or something like that. He definitely sees even that pursuit of a particular vocation is a development of the mind leading to contemplation of God ultimately,
Yeah.
which is quite beautiful.
Yeah, and it sounds like, Father Edward Leen is very Aristotelian in that sense, like you said,
Yes.
about if you're going to be a plumber, well, be a good plumber. And, of course, Aristotle would say that virtue is, in the loose sense, a virtue is basically any good habit, right? Any skill or talent that you develop. But so on Aristotle's side, a virtue, is any kind of maybe skill or like, you're being a plumber. But for us as Catholics, a virtue is not simply developing a talent or a skill to be good at, say, plumbing or basketball or cooking or whatever it might be, woodworking, right? It's actually going to be the habit of being a good person. And I think that's kind of that's what makes a classical education. If we're going to talk about the liberal arts, what is it that makes the liberal arts different from another education? What is it that makes a classical education different from a normal education? And I think it's exactly that. It's specifically the virtue of being a good person. Because you can go to, like, say, medical school and you can learn to be a good doctor. Or you can go to, I don't know, flight school and you can learn to be a good pilot. Or you can go to, math school, and become really, really good at math. So those are kind of like virtues in the sense of being a skill or a developed talent. But I think that the classical education, what we're trying to offer as Catholics, we're not just developing this skill or that skill. We're actually developing the skill of being a human person and being a good person. And of course, you might have to ask, well, what makes a good person? Well, that depends kind of on what the goal of being a person is, right? Because we define good or bad based upon the goal. So that's what makes me think that a classical education is not just for some or just for a few. A classical education is for everyone. Everyone needs to have a classical education, because a classical education is the only education that teaches you how to be a man, how to be a human, how to be a good person. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I agree. I would just maybe sort of circle back and make just one little qualification there
Sure.
that I don't think is a disagreement, but
Sure.
just a clarity. So I would say, especially in Father Lean's book, because his title is "What is True Education" or "What is Catholic Education?" Ultimately, he's not asking what is classical education actually,
Okay.
and
Okay.
so I would make that little distinction, especially at least for Father Leen.
Okay.
So I would say the classical education, the classical formation is, as you described it, makes the integral man. And let me see. I have a little quote here from Father Lean's chapter on education and mental formation, and the
Okay.
sort of the integrity here. I'll just read a little section. And here he's talking about as a Catholic school in particular, but I think this applies to the classical school.
Mhm.
He says, a school is not a Catholic school because it's staffed by Catholic teachers and has only Catholic pupils on its school roll. To be Catholic, all its teaching must have deliberately as a background the Catholic philosophy of life,
Mhm.
and must be positively and actually related to that background. It is not enough that such a philosophy of life be assumed. It must be actively inculcated, for it is but too common to find the practice of the Catholic religion allied with an approach to life's interests, in great part un-Catholic. This unfortunate and dangerous conjunction of incompatibles is necessarily fostered if each teacher is concerned exclusively with his own subject and teaches it without of relation to religion. If he teaches Latin for Latin's sake, Greek for Greek's sake, French for the sake of French, mathematics for the sake of mathematics, and so on. Further, if the same attitude is adopted in the class of Christian doctrine, the result cannot be other than the formation in the pupil of a disjointed mind, a mind that is but a cabinet made up of separate and distinct compartments. Each subject of knowledge has its own separate recess. An intellect cultivated in this way becomes a warehouse of facts and figures, weights and measures, syntax and vocabulary, but not of an instrument for the exploration of reality and the discovery of truth. So there he's applying that to the Catholic education, but I think you could apply that very similarly to the difference between a modern, okay, we study math for the sake of you're going to get a degree in engineering. Same sort of thing, this compartmentalization of a formation. And I say naturally, even the classical education is looking for something that's more human and less mechanistic. So there. And then in Father Leen's chapter on education and philosophy of life, I wanted to read another section from there, which I think is very similar, but just sums it up very, very nicely. The supreme achievement of education from the intellectual viewpoint is to impart a proper understanding of God, his ways, and his purposes. To have right views of God is to see the world right. From a right view of the universe springs a sane philosophy of life. It is a function of the educational process to impart such a philosophy, to be acquainted with God, to know him well, to be conversant with his ways, to share his outlook. That is the goal of intellectual and moral formation. So there, the first one, he's showing, I think he can be applied both to the Catholic education and to the classical. There is this integrity of what is human, but I think the classical education doesn't necessarily have revelation. And so Father Leen, especially in this far end, takes that revelation and really says, know what God knows. Think what God thinks because he's told us. And that changes everything.
And that's very interesting for me because, you know what, I don't think I've ever quite thought about it that way. I guess I always kind of equated the classical education with the Catholic education. But you know what, I think I just kind of realized what you're saying, that the classical education, classical means, you know, hearkening back to the Greco-Roman tradition, right? So classical education is kind of the Aristotelian education where you learn to become a good human, but
a good pagan.
But the Catholic education
yes,
makes you a good Catholic, so a saint.
Right, exactly.
And Aristotle, of course, we know he didn't have revelation, so there's so much that we can know about God and what it means to be a good person, a good Catholic, and heaven, right? You know, that Aristotle could never have imagined. He never could have imagined that God would call us his friends. So that makes our goal as educators, you know, just immense and, you know, unbelievable. What a privilege to be able to teach. But you know what? I think you'll agree with me on this. Teaching is hard.
Yes.
It's got to be like the hardest thing out there, because people forget that, as Father Leen correctly said in that quote at the beginning that you read to us, we're not just trying to pump information or data into kids' heads. You know, it's not just about knowledge. People forget that we have two intellectual faculties, the intellect and the will. So the intellect's for knowing and the will for loving. And so we actually have to not just give them knowledge, but actually form the will. And that's like really, really hard to do, in my opinion. You know, like how do you form someone's will? So that's why the ancients, I think Aristotle talked about this. I don't remember where, but Socrates believed that knowledge is virtue. And so that if you know stuff, then you'll be good, right? As opposed to people who do bad things, you know, through ignorance or whatever. And Aristotle disagreed with him on that. He said, well, no, you can know the right thing to do and still not do it. So it became kind of a question for, you know, the ancient philosophers. Can you teach virtue? You know, how do you teach virtue?
Yeah.
Well, you know, yeah, you can. I don't remember who it was, but maybe it was Socrates. But he answered, well, no, you can't really teach virtue, because if you could, then everybody would go to school to learn it. And, you know, parents would make sure their kids, you know, learned how to be virtuous, just like you can make sure they learn their math or they learn their grammar or whatever. But virtue is kind of a different thing. How do you teach virtue? So what do you think about that? how do you teach virtue? How do you form the will?
Ed, if I had a complete answer to this, I don't know what the answer
Well, I
where
mean,
I'd
it's
be, but
yeah,
that's exactly the conundrum of
it's kind of
of
a conundrum.
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
how do you form someone else's will? It's like you try to show them the good and hope that they'll choose it.
right, and that's where having how about this?
Yeah.
Would you say that perhaps now that we have this sort of classical versus Catholic education,
Yeah.
would you say that the classical education forms the intellect, obviously to a degree, and the
So,
Catholic education forms the will? I'm not
ooh,
sure if I'm quite comfortable with that completely, but there was a certain amount of natural virtue, but still the pagans were so there was just something that was so missing that
hmm.
you know I just I don't think that I like that quite as pairing up, but I've been thinking about it for a little while now, and I really don't know. I was wondering what you had to think about that,
Huh,
if I can challenge it.
I mean, I guess I don't think exactly, but because I think that if we were talking about noble pagans and the Aristotle types and the classical education as we've now sort of delineated, I think that can educate the intellect and the will, but it doesn't have the advantage that the Catholic education gives, which is grace,
Right,
because you can't move somebody else's will. We have free will. Who's the only person who can move somebody's will? God. And so God can give grace. And so in the Catholic education, we get to pray for each other, we get to pray for our students. And so there's that addition, so that how would I say, it's not that the classical education just forms the intellect and the Catholic has the addition of forming the will, but that the Catholic education has, you could almost say, an infinite advantage in the ability to educate the intellect and the will. What do you think about that?
yeah, that's actually pretty much kind of what I came to myself for an answer is I think is that yeah, how you can if I'm trying to teach someone a better understanding of the laws of mathematics, Pythagoras spent his whole life, studying ratios and proportions and musical scales and all these beautiful things and came to a greater intellectual knowledge, and man naturally wants to know,
Yeah.
and he can show people who are interested, and they will want it, and if they don't want it, they don't want it. So there's a certain degree, but again, it seems so odd to how do you teach someone how to be good?
Yeah.
It's like only grace can really move that will to desire the good in this particular case.
Yeah.
And of course, all men desire the good. And I feel like I'm running into this just sort of the obvious effects of original sin.
Mhm.
Our weakness, concupiscence, ignorance, and malice all stacked together makes it look like oftentimes the will does not actually desire the good. It's kind of hard. You kind of have to think about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe it's just that it's harder to see that, if you see, if someone sees the beauty of truth, it's pretty
Yeah.
clear. Oh, wow, that's true. And you kind of have to fight against it to lie.
Yeah.
But when you see someone doing good, like there's a deep dark place that you want to imitate it, but it's
Mhm.
just so much easier to have a mob who takes the guy out, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
It's
Because
just less obvious.
we know that the will it's geared towards the good, but we have free will, so that means the will doesn't have to pick any particular good. It gets to choose between goods.
Right.
And so I think you're right that it's really about truth, and it's really about goodness. And so if we can put the goodness in front of students in truth and teach them what the goal is, the ultimate good, because the ultimate good is where we get particular goods from, right? They're only good because it leads to the ultimate good. If we can show them that, then the hope is that they'll choose that with their free will. Even the word educate, it doesn't mean to fill, like to, to put knowledge in, even though we have to do that. It means to draw out. And so we're trying to draw out that choice in them to choose the good. And I think that's a beautiful job, beautiful life, and a beautiful vocation. I think it's one of the greatest things out there, but it's not easy, is it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree. Now, I just want to throw a little wrench in there, just to get you to see what you got to say. So, in our definition, so Edward Father Leen would agree that it's a culture of mind for the will and the intellect. How do you form the emotions? Does yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Is that it, or is there more to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got what I'm going. Yeah, how do you form the emotions? Are those necessary? Are those accidental? What does that even look like? Is that primary, secondary, tertiary? Where does that come into the equation when you're teaching? Are they
Yeah.
at all necessary?
Yeah. Now that's like one of my favorite subjects on the whole wide world, on the face of the earth. That's like one of my favorite subjects to talk about because, and maybe we can maybe that's like a good question to end with. It's just, well, how do you form the emotions? How do you educate the emotions? Because first of all, we're going to have to talk about what are emotions, because emotion is kind of a modern word. Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas talked about the passions, and the passions are so easily definable. There's like a flow chart, that it's just like, if you have this or that, you have this passion. If you're doing this, and if you want this good but you can't have it, you have this passion. If you want this good and you get it, then you have the passion of joy, etc. So passions are so easy and clear and like straightforward. Emotions, that's a little bit more like muddy water. So sometimes people today, they just say, oh, emotions are the same thing as passions. I don't think so. I'm no expert on this. I don't really think that when we say emotion, I don't think we really mean the same thing as passions. And it's a really interesting question because the Stoics, the Stoic philosophers, and there are a lot of neo-Stoics today. People like Jordan Peterson are kind of leading this huge movement of modern Stoicism. The Stoic idea is kind of, well, emotions are bad and passions are bad, so we need to suppress them. Not the Catholic idea, right? Not in a Catholic education. In a Catholic education, you don't suppress the emotions or suppress the passions. You form them, you train them, you teach them to work for the will. And I would like to say, and maybe we can end with this because we're running out of time here a little bit, but I'd like to kind of give everybody something to think about on this. I'd like to say that the passions are like the army, and the will is like a king. And so the king is pretty powerless without his army. And so the will is pretty powerless without the passions. And I didn't make that up. That's from St. Thomas Aquinas.
That's great. If I can, do we have enough time for the one last question? As I would say, I would ask, is it through the forming of the will that the passions or emotions are ordered, or is it through the emotions that you reach the intellect and the will, or are they completely symbiotic and simultaneous? How about that?
I think so. I think it's both ways. I think they work both ways. One influences the other. Just like, you start off as a baby loving your mother without much intellectual activity, and then that grows into an intellectual virtue, right? You can do that virtuously. But St. Thomas Aquinas actually says, and this is something that I can't stop thinking about. St. Thomas Aquinas says, the more the will is moved to something, the more it causes passion. So that's the other way around. And I can't stop thinking about the ramifications of that quote.
Yeah.
All right. See you next time.
Take care, Ed. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.